Howdy folks, welcome to another episode of DevOps Diaries. A little bit of a special treat for you today. I have Wade Wegner from DigitalOcean with me. Wade, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Wade, do you want to tell the listeners in your own words why I invited you on to the podcast?
Well,
do you have a good answer for that?
I suspect it has something to do with my time at Salesforce building SalesforceDX. So you can tell me.
It absolutely does. Yeah, it absolutely does. I think this is a really cool opportunity to, first and foremost, have the opportunity to have this conversation with you and to give the listeners of this podcast somewhat of a history lesson. And the Salesforce developer experience has dramatically changed over even my time at GearSet, but you yourself were a core part of the reason that that developer experience started to shift. So it's a great opportunity to chat to you today about that. Wade, you joined Salesforce in 2016. Tell me a little bit about when you joined and what it was like at Salesforce back then.
Yeah, feels like a long time ago. I guess in some respects it has been. There were really, so kind of rewinding, there were two reasons why I even had the opportunity to join Salesforce. So if everyone thinks back 2016, the developer landscape and ecosystem for Salesforce was dramatically different. And I'm sure we'll get more into that. But generally, I would say that there were certain things, particularly doing continuous deployment and continuous integration on the platform was pretty difficult. So two things happened that resulted in a job rec getting opened that eventually I ended up getting hired for. The first was Financial Force. So if everyone remembers Financial Force, Andy Fawcett in particular had done some really clever things back in 2016 where Financial Force was doing a bunch of UI automation to create DE orgs so that they had like brand new pristine environments. And then they would install all their packages into them and then basically run a bunch of their unit tests. So they basically found a way to create what would possibly be more like the equivalent of like having Scratch orgs and, like a Git-based, CI/CD system that allowed them to automate a bunch of their testing. They did so by like creating a bunch of DE orgs and then running all their stuff against it. And honestly, like kudos to them for figuring that out. And I eventually ended up hiring Andy Fawcett into Salesforce, and love the guy, still a tremendous friend. But that presented some problems where people may or may not know, and I don't actually know if this is still the case, but a DE org at Salesforce was actually running in a production pod. And so what would happen is when Financial Force would do this and then run all their tests, there were times that it would actually degrade the environment and affect production instances of customers. And I think even brought the pod down a time or two as well. So again,
that's no good.
That's no good. No one wants that. I mean, and again, not casting aspersions to Financial Force, they were doing the best they could with the tools provided. And, but it resulted in that. So the leadership at the time was clearly thinking we need to make a change here because, our biggest ISVs are trying to accomplish things on our platform and it's just too hard. And this is what they're doing. And this is what it's resulting in. So that was one thing. And then the second was in 2016, you can go back and look at it. Salesforce was listed as the #1 most dreaded platform by developers on Stack Overflow.
Dreaded platform.
Yes, the #1 most dreaded platform by developers. So, I used to joke that Salesforce loves being #1, but that's not one where Salesforce is really excited about it. So so those were two just some backdrops to why the rec and the opportunity even was created. And then I got just lucky enough, right place, right time, knew the right people where I ended up getting the job. But that was just that's just one facet of it. I mean, even when I joined, we can get into it, but a lot of work had been done and a lot of analysis had already occurred at Salesforce to start trying to build a perspective on what needed to change. And so, I was pretty lucky in 2016 to jump right in and get to work with the team. So
yeah. Well, you say you're lucky enough. You have a background from Microsoft, which is impressive too, leading the evangelism team and then product management at Microsoft as well. How much of benefit do you think having that experience from Microsoft was while stepping into Salesforce, or was it even a hindrance? You know, because I speak to a lot of people that come from different software dev backgrounds, and Salesforce is a different beast.
Different,
Was that the
yeah.
same experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this ultimately, it's a really good leading question, which we didn't coordinate. So, but it, I think, sets this up pretty well. So for those, I mean, even today, I'm sure Salesforce continues to be a little bit of a special snowflake, right? There are enough
Sure.
things that are unique. Like even being a metadata driven platform to some regard, there's not a lot of examples of other platforms that are out there like that. So, it inherently, will make some of the things unique and special to Salesforce. But back in 2016, I mean, it was a totally different, unique development experience. I mean, so like if you were successful as a Java developer or a .NET developer, and basically it had a set of experiences working in the industry, and then you switched over to become a Salesforce developer, it was a steep learning curve, and there was very little skill sets that you could maybe apply from one part of what you've done in the past to what you needed to do in the future. And it's not entirely true, but generally, like, I think that, working in like the whole concept of an org, and, org being a combination of data, metadata, and code just blows people's minds, right? And so like, and coupled with the fact that, if you were used to using version control systems and working in environments with multiple developers, like all of that changed, right? You had to kind of rethink how you approached that with Salesforce. So I would say my background was very helpful in the sense that I was familiar with just kind of like the best practices that weren't even really specific to Microsoft, but in general, just best practices that had evolved for software developers and for, developers all up. And so when coming to Salesforce, a big part of this was, and I'll get to some of the cast of characters that I worked with here in a moment, because it's just amazing individuals. But we had a set of core design philosophies which were centered around, not being different, not being a special snowflake. We wanted people to be able to bring their experiences building elsewhere and leverage them within Salesforce to be productive faster. And so we wanted there to be more corollaries to the kinds of things that developers already knew within the Salesforce platform. So yeah, and then one other thing I'll highlight is I have also a consulting background, and so prior to even being at Microsoft, one of the fun things about being a consultant is, 1 week you're doing one project, and then you're on the bench for like a week, and then you get assigned to do something else, and you're sold as the quote unquote expert, right? And so you have like a week. It's like you're like, here's a book, Wade. Read this. We're billing you out as an expert at this hourly rate. So you gotta learn fast. And I had some exposure through all of that to Salesforce, which meant that I didn't come to Salesforce with without some fundamental background in interacting with the metadata API and some packaging and Apex and things like that. Not to say that I was an expert by any means, but I had at least a baseline.
Yeah, you're consulting a continual baptism of fire, even now, even still.
Yeah.
I think that's a fairly universal experience.
I'll also say so I knew a number of folks. So like a lot of your listeners may remember a gentleman named Adam Seligman. So known for a lot of different things. I mean, he was a GM of the platform at one point. He ran developer relations. He was one of the original creators of Trailhead. So he had an incredible career at Salesforce. And one of the things that when I was with Seligman, or having known Adam Seligman and I knew each other from Microsoft before he went to Salesforce. And he had invited me at one point to come to a hackathon where I got to meet Dave Carroll and Pat Patterson, who's also known as Metadaddy. So I don't know if you know Pat Patterson, but he was a incredible evangelist back in the day. And so that team built so many really cool things. Like one of the things I remember Pat Patterson built, and this is again before I joined, so this is probably 2014 through 2015, is he built a Minecraft integration into Salesforce. And I don't remember all the details, but basically he was able to build a house, and like the house had you could interact with elements of the house that were all objects inside of Salesforce. And so like through the metadata API, he was creating literally structures like buildings out of objects where you could interact with the data in Minecraft, and it was connecting to Sil. And so like I just thought things like that were super cool. And so that was a, and then I tried it out myself and played with it. So it was a great exposure to like the metadata API and getting to learn about metadata and how it all worked. So
yeah, that's the one thing that continues to impress me about the Salesforce ecosystem and the people building is they will go out and find creative things to do with the platform, and they will find things that interest them. Like my son loves Minecraft, and if I told him that I could do something like that in Salesforce and build an org for him and help them understand, it's such a great way to get people involved in the technology. And I think that's one of the things that I commend the Salesforce team with Trailhead for doing is creating those fun demo environments and building it to where I was. But you think about 2016. So you were on stage with Srini in 2016 at Dreamforce, introducing SalesforceDX to folks.
Was it? So I don't know. I have a terrible memory for especially dates. I know that I think I joined in 2016, but I think we might have spent like a year or so building before we really launched. So I don't remember exactly the dates, to be honest.
So in my research
with Srini,
So in my research, there was the developer keynote from 2016 where with the concept of DX was introduced, and then DX generally available winter 2018. Can you tell me a little bit about that period between 2016 end of 2016 and 2018 going to GA? We've got this idea. We've got this vision.
Do you mind if I start a little bit before 2016? Because
of course,
again, we can get a little kind of geeky insiderish here because a lot happened. So I joined in 2015 or earlier. I can't even remember. But again, one of the things I alluded to earlier is that some work had already been underway for a little while. And so at Salesforce, there was a principal architect named Jim Wunderlich. And so folks who joined keynotes and so forth at different times may have had an opportunity to hear from Jim. Brilliant guy, had been with Salesforce for a long time, really understood, both how it was used, but then, the thing that I always found fascinating is, there's engineers building internally and writing Java code, creating everything else that we interact with, right? So Jim knew both sides of the equation extremely well. So he was very well versed with how Salesforce worked internally. And so Jim had been assigned to work with Financial Force basically after these outages or these kind of like incidents around CI/CD, and been tasked to figure out what is a better way for them to be successful. Like, how do we make our largest ISVs successful building on our platform where they have the tools they need to control the outcomes that they care about without negatively impacting the underlying infrastructure. And so Jim ended up writing a brief, and that brief was called Project Janus. And so that was the name of kind of like his analysis. And so in Project Janus is where a lot of the things that people think about and relate to SalesforceDX were conceived originally. So scratch orgs, like the scratch org concept was born out of Project Janus, and it was born out of this recognition that teams needed pristine environments that you could just throw away when you were done. They were disposable, right? One-time use type of environments, right? And I think originally scratch orgs were really envisioned to work hand in hand with packaging, and this is where second generation packaging as a concept came into play, which also then brought in this idea of source-driven development as well, which is like all of your source you can express external from an org, commit it into a repo, and then have a set of tools that you could use to generate packages, to deploy into like all those sorts of things, right? And so Project Janus, really codified, I think, a lot of the fundamental principles that ended up eventually becoming SalesforceDX. But I'll note that again, because Jim was working with Financial Force, there was a very heavy like ISV dimension to it, right? And so a lot of the early work around SalesforceDX was not meant to initially replace the entire developer experience, but it was really focused on like, how do we get ISVs with packaging more successful? And so when I joined, that's kind of the world that it existed. And so what's nice about that is by the time I joined, Jim had already identified like a bunch of the teams that needed to work on this. And along with a gentleman named Doug Scott, who was the head of platform engineering at the time. I don't actually know if he's still at Salesforce or not, but Jim worked with Doug Scott. Doug Scott and my boss, who was eventually, or who became my boss, was Adrian Kunzel. Doug Scott and Adrian had gotten the buy-in from basically everyone they needed to at Salesforce to make sure all the teams that needed to work together to basically make this vision a reality all got organized into one basically engineering and product organization. And so, Scott Musson was my counterpart on the engineering side. So Jim Wunderlich was our architect. Scott Musson ran engineering, and then I ran product. And so by the time I came in at that point, like it was really pretty amazing to think about it. We basically had all the teams and everything we needed to own our own destiny, which was just incredible. And so we were able to move pretty fast. One of the things that I really appreciated about Scott Musson is, building at Salesforce, you have not only are you building net new things, but you're responsible for maintaining existing things. And so almost every team at Salesforce, I don't want to, the word burdened is wrong because it makes it sound like it's a bad thing, but, they're responsible for, fixing bugs or dealing with, whatever the normal, types of, workloads. Like maybe there's requests from customers that you need to take advantage, you need to work on, and so they bump the queue, and they are things. And so one of the things Scott Musson ended up doing, which was great, is he organized his teams so that some of the teams carried maybe the lion's share of the burden for doing a lot of the management of different things, like maintaining the metadata API and so forth. And he created these new teams that were not encumbered by anything that existed and were purely focused on innovation. And so that really enabled us to move pretty fast. And so some of those early teams, I'm forgetting what they were called, but basically like the Scratch org team was pretty much like a net new team. They did have responsibility for, I'm trying to think what it was. There was one API that was highly aligned with Scratch orgs. I'm blanking on it, but like basically they pretty much only worked on building Scratch orgs. And then there was a team we had that eventually built the CLI, and all they were doing was building the CLI. And we had a team working on source-driven development. So, how do we end up building? Because I think we ended up building a new API for it, but it was like, oh no, we used the metadata API with a lot of code in front of it. But basically, how do you externalize source out of an org, and how do you deploy it into an org? Because if you remember some of the early things, like you do a push and a pull, and
yeah,
those commands. So we ended up creating a bunch of those teams, and so we were able to move pretty fast on a number of dimensions. And so eventually it got to the point where we ended up having after we did a review with Benioff, which is that's a fun story. But got through a bunch of those internal reviews, and found ourselves before Dreamforce with the opportunity to showcase this. And it was still pretty early, but we did open it up. I forget what we opened it up as, maybe a preview or a pilot or something like that. But we had Scratch orgs, we had CLI, we had the basics for like moving metadata in and out, and it was a great starting point for us at that Dreamforce. So
yeah, it's interesting that you bring up this separation of teams and the separations of duties for business as usual, maintain all this stuff, make sure everything else still works, and have these folks over here that are focused on innovation and the separate products. For you with your product manager hat on, what does it take to build a cohesive suite of products like SalesforceDX whilst having those separate teams working on those different products? Is there anything that you can attribute, any particular skills that you can attribute to making that successful?
I think I guess maybe there's some skills, but I'd say more than anything, I think what is necessary is having a very detailed and strategic plan, along with really great alignment across all the functions, and really great mechanisms for rapid iteration and diffusing all the information you need to all the right people. So we had amongst all this, we had amazing TPMs, so technical program managers, who, kind of basically were at the heart of, every single thing that we were doing across all these teams. So like, you think we used to have, I forget what these stood for, but they're called PCTs. Have you ever heard about like PCTs as a concept at Salesforce? I don't know if they still exist or not. I don't remember what they stand for. It was something weird, like maybe it was like a program committee team or something like that. But the idea was, because Salesforce, at least back then and maybe today, was highly functional, right? Like engineering and product didn't meet organizationally, I think, at the time until you got to like Parker. And so, there was a whole product management team, and there was a whole engineering team. There was a whole, design team. And so very, very functional. And so to work as a team, you needed to create ceremonies and mechanisms that really required the right people to come together at the right time. So we had these things called the SalesforceDX. Well, eventually, originally it was called ACDX. No, was it AC? What was it? SFD. Originally it was, yes, it was ACDX, because when I joined, platform was App Cloud. Yes. Do you remember that? Salesforce App Cloud.
Yes, so we only because I watched that keynote.
Yeah, we were originally App Cloud. So our original thing was ACDX, and it was like ACDC logo with an X instead.
That's so funny. I'm wearing this metadata T-shirt in the style of Metallica. I'm in the right frame of mind.
Yeah. In fact, like our early CLI wasn't SFDX or SF. It was actually App Cloud. So you'd type App Cloud. I don't remember if that was the case in 2016, to be honest. So I don't remember if we had switched it to SFDX already at that point or not. But originally the CLI command, the binary name was App Cloud. So we used to have an App Cloud, like a ACDX PCT every week. And so it basically like kind of a scrum of scrums, so to speak. Like we kept track of and talked through everything. And, I think I will say one thing that helped me, and I'm sure other product leaders would find different ways with which they would be successful, but I'm a developer by nature. And so I was constantly, building on the latest things. And so, back in the day, I had a lot of fun building, CLI plugins and all kinds of different things that kind of like pushed the envelope of what it was that you could end up doing. But I was constantly iterating on what the teams were building, logging bugs, figuring out what worked, what didn't, things like that. And then we were very lucky that we had some early partners as well, like Financial Force and so forth, that were also constantly trying to see, like, can we use everything that you're building to be successful? So I probably did a terrible job of answering your question, but, having that cross-functional, heartbeat to manage what we were doing, constantly using what we were building, working with customers. I mean, it was very, very iterative in terms of how we went about building and working on things. And it also helped that at the time, we were one of the more celebrated things, even internally. Like there was a lot of excitement at Salesforce and across the platform for what we were doing, which is, like Benioff doesn't do like internal reviews of developer stuff often, but like even he cared about it. And so we found that really helpful too, because if and when we had dependencies on other teams, we were able to like point to the V2 mom and be like, hey, this is important, and generally, things would move pretty fast. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about it? Do you think it was celebrated? Was it? I'll make it. I can make it as many assumptions in my brain as I like. But if you talk about Financial Force and the ISV partners in the Salesforce ecosystem, which I would believe have contributed hugely to Salesforce's success, sure. Is that why it was important to people like Mark? Because ISVs that were extending the capabilities of Salesforce and doing a good job for Salesforce customers had these issues, if you like? that Salesforce were like, okay, let's invest time in making this a better experience?
Yeah, I for sure I think that that's a part of it. But I think there's even something maybe a little more fundamental that I think is cool, which is I think people just geeked out on it to a degree and, really thought it was kind of magical. So, I mean, imagine, you've been doing Salesforce for a decade or longer, and suddenly someone comes along and opens up a terminal, and you've never really spent a lot of time in the terminal. Maybe you've used like the AMP migration tool back in the day. If I don't even know if that's a thing any longer, because I think
it was retired last year.
So which is funny because we were trying to deprecate and retire that, in 2016, 2017. Shows you how long it takes. But probably spent very little time in a terminal, and then suddenly like someone runs this very simple command, which I think is like SFDX org :create -m, pointing to a definition file, and hit enter or something like that, right? And within seconds, an org is created, and you do SFDX org, was it org open or something like that? But like basically now you open the org, and you automatically log into it because your credentials have been stored in a brand new pristine org that you just created on the fly for whatever it suddenly existed. And I mean, people's minds were blown by this, right? Because everyone was just familiar with like sandboxes or dev sandboxes or DE orgs, and back then, like, everyone was always worried about keeping their environment clean and pristine and not polluting it, or remember, like, the Trailhead team created this, like, you could create a forget what they called them, but like this Trailhead org, and then you could attach all your DE orgs to it, because people generally would have like 80 DE orgs, and you're like, where does that Apex code live? And no one ever knew. And so like, it just, I think, blew people's minds. It was a totally different way of thinking about interacting with Salesforce. And so there was an element too of just like, reveling in the geeky nature of it, and what it represented. So
it's still widely revered and widely used. I think if I look at Gearset as a tool, for example, you've visited us, Gearset, our offices back when you were at Salesforce, and got to know the team here. DXs and developers are still very attached to what they can do in the CLI and the tooling that Salesforce still continues to invest in to give them a good developer experience. Where we come in, we're trying to bridge that gap between the developer experience that Salesforce gives developers and the admin experience to, I'm not saying that every admin should go and learn to code. I think they should go and have a good understanding of what metadata looks like in source format. But those gaps in SalesforceDX still being one of those that primary way that developers still like to interact with the platform is a huge testament to what you and the team did in regards to SalesforceDX. Is there any moments that you're particularly proud of throughout your time at Salesforce where you were like, yes, we've done the right thing here, and this is going to be the future of how developers interact with the platform and how they build?
There's a few. There's a few where I feel like I may have also personally had a little bit of a hand in it too. So one of the early ones, I think I alluded to this App Cloud CLI. I think early on, and this would probably have been within the first few months I was at Salesforce, when we were building the CLI, it was getting built from scratch, like a custom CLI built ground up. And one of the things that I was very familiar with was Heroku at the time, and so was familiar with the Heroku CLI, and was a big advocate for us to actually, and this is pre-Oakleaf, not by much, but it is still pre-Oakleaf. And if folks aren't familiar, Oakleaf is the open CLI framework that Heroku creates, and ultimately I think even today the SF and the SFDX and the Heroku CLIs are all built on Oakleaf. But I was a big proponent for basically using Heroku CLI as the foundation for what we were doing. And part of it was because of its plugin nature and the modularity of it. And so I was a big believer that the way that we wanted to do this was treat the CLI as a set of kind of like plugins and modules that could be taken advantage of by developers and then extended by developers. And so, I think actually it's been a while, so you could tell me if this is still the case, but for a while there, there was a proliferation, lots of CLI plugins getting built for SalesforceDX.
Oh yeah, it still is.
And the reason for it is you could take advantage of like the authentication module and plugin and basically everything else that existed and just attach to it. So you didn't have to figure out how to, authenticate and connect to orgs, or you didn't have to think about how to manage or store, your identities locally. All that was managed for you by it. You could just create a plugin, take advantage of, I'm forgetting some of the, I think there was like an orgs, it's been a while since I've done it, but like basically you just take advantage of what was already there and then you just build your stuff off of it and people could just install your plugin. So I was very happy. I won't say that was a big battle that was fought, but like there was definitely people who didn't want to go that direction early and they wanted to build something from scratch. And I think we made the right decision there. So that was one. I can't remember, maybe you can remind me. I think at the Salesforce, at Dreamforce in the developer keynote in 2016, we showed the Force IDE. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And it was a Salesforce version of Eclipse that had been built for us. Because at the time we weren't doing VS Code.
Yes, I can't remember if it was still just a terminal, but I don't know if you called it Force IDE or
I think
if
it was called the Force IDE, and it was basically Eclipse that we had built so that you didn't really realize it was Eclipse, but we had built it as a thing for us to use that understood the CLI and other things. At any rate, long story short, we did a bunch of work, and it just was not a great tool. It was not flexible. It was very cumbersome for our developers, like our engineers, to build what we wanted. And at the time, like VS Code was taking over the ecosystem. And so this actually required a lot of internal debating and debates and alignment, because at the time, Salesforce and Microsoft have been like frenemies back and forth, for a long period of time. And I think we were in a period where we were not as friendly. And so it required a lot of approvals for me to end up getting it so that we could basically build a VS Code extension. And I remember, meeting with Srini and Parker, and maybe, I don't remember Mark being involved, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was. But Sarah Franklin was involved and became quite an advocate for it. So like, doing, and we're talking, it was like months of internal debate and so forth. But finally, I think the right reason won out, and we were able to move forward and start to build a lot of our functionality as an extension within VS Code. And so I think that was tremendous, because even now, it's been a while, but I know Karen Fidelic is still, I think, leading Code Builder. And like, there's a natural relationship between that decision and the ability to like use extensions. And VS Code is built in Monaco, which is open source. And so, it really set the stage, because our vision was to basically even build more of a web IDE using Monaco and everything else, so that we had the ability to create this really seamless experience, whether you were in VS Code all the way to whether or not you worked in the browser. So that was a big one.
It's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned Microsoft being frenemies. I think it's still frenemies based on, especially with the advancements of AI and where we are now, and Microsoft's offerings and what have you. That's another totally different string of conversation. It's funny that you mentioned Karen's name. Karen now leads the DevOps Center team, and what Salesforce have released, the DevOps Center. Was DevOps Center a concept when you were at Salesforce? Start? Yeah,
so like DevOps Center, Code Builder, all these things started early on, because part of my team, I'm trying to remember the tool. What was the tool the admins always used for deploying metadata from one org to another?
Change sets,
yeah. So like my teams were responsible for change sets, and like everyone hated change sets, but like everyone was addicted to it, right? Like, so, so from the very beginning, like, yes, again, rewinding a little bit. So ACDX and like what we were doing for SalesforceDX first was very ISV focused. But I would say within that first year, we recognized like, hey, this is going to be powerful, not just for ISVs, but for basically all developers, even developers that work at, companies that, have very large internal Salesforce, deployments and things like that. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, even when I was there, like we started working on Code Builder and, oh, sorry, what was it called again? The thing that Karen's working on?
DevOps Center.
DevOps Center, thank you. Like DevOps Center, all these things started probably like, I don't know, 2020. And they just, the thing that's interesting about Salesforce is eventually, I told you that Scott Musson, one of the things that he was able to do that was great was he created these teams that were unencumbered by a bunch of other responsibilities. It only lasts so long. Once you ship scratch orgs and you ship, all these things, before you know it, you're responsible for the same workload. So innovation slowed down, and Salesforce is such now, like, I don't know the details, but I would be surprised if DevOps Center had more than five engineers on it. Maybe less, maybe more. I don't know. But like what it means is you measure progress in multiple releases across multiple years. And so, like I think I saw recently, so like Rohit Mehta was also on the team, Delete Berkey, and I still see things that they've recently shipped that we had started working on back in like 2020. So
yeah, there was an interesting session at Dreamforce last year that I attended about Scratchwork snapshots, and they were excited to get it out. And
yes, that's a great one, just like, right?
Yeah, that is a great one, and it's funny that you say that, because I think many folks in the ecosystem will look at things that Salesforce released and they go, why haven't they done that yet? Or thought about this yet? And it sounds, from this conversation, it sounds like a lot of these things are already thought of. They're just not there yet.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a while. Second generation packaging is a great example of something as well, where, Delete has been, I'm not sure what the status of it is, if it's changed. Maybe it's called something else now, but
still exists. 2GP, yeah.
Yeah, 2GP. So, but it was such a fundamental re-architecture of the packaging technology that like it took a long, long time. It was very, very complicated. And plus, think about packaging. Packaging is, even first, like, it's actually a brilliant thing. Imagine, can you point to any other platform in the world where you've got this concept of like a company has this org, right? Again, org is data, metadata, code, and they can purchase and or install code, data, and metadata from a third party, install it into their org, and then there's manageability rules that kind of makes it so that based on how it's been set up, you can't screw their stuff up, they can't really screw your stuff up, yet it all works together. I mean, it's actually pretty amazing that this even works.
Yeah.
And I think it's a testament to just, the brilliance of the model and how it evolved over time. And like, I mean, honestly, to me, Salesforce was always way more interesting as a platform than it was as a CRM or anything else like that. But that's powerful stuff. And so, you imagine now trying to build a different model where, the packaging infrastructure is more flexible because, there were all sorts of things that ISVs wanted to be able to do that they just couldn't with the first generation packaging architecture. So rebuilding that in the complex, it just took a long time, and it had to be very careful, very deliberate. Like, you can't afford to screw this up along the way. People have sunk too much money in investing in building these environments to risk, some mistake going and blowing things up. So
yeah, no, it's the. I think it's interesting how people are still figuring out this way of working. You have such deep expertise and knowledge because you built the thing, and I feel like there could be more understanding of some of these features and functionality and the depth of the platform. I think with the scale of Salesforce itself,
I think
there's so much to learn and so much to do. Yeah. Like, how do you build and develop that deep expertise to implement 2GPs in an everyday business, not just an ISV, because it is useful. And I had a gentleman on the podcast a couple of episodes ago, Mitch Spano, who is an engineer at Google, and he spent a whole host of time, and his team has spent a whole host of time trying to re-architecture Google's Salesforce orgs to support 2GP. And he's like, when it works, it's phenomenal, but getting us there is actually really difficult.
Yeah. I think there's always challenges when these fundamental shifts in how things work take so long, because eventually, I'll just say, like, eventually Salesforce as a larger company has a attention deficit disorder, and you switch its focus, right, year over year. And so what was neat for me is the first few years, maybe like the first 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of support across all of Salesforce. Like, it wasn't hard to get DX and Dreamforce keynotes and things like that, because it was top of mind, and it was topical, and it was in the company's RAM, so to speak. It was right there. But then things, the company gets excited about the next thing and the next thing, and so, like, CVPs became a big topic, and then I think I've heard that AI and agents are a big thing at Salesforce now. And so part of the challenge is the company moves on, and you're still building to this roadmap, and so it means that the megaphone highlighting all of the things that you're doing isn't necessarily working for you, because it's highlighting other things. And so, I again, what was great early days is what we were doing on the platform was aligned to what Adam Seligman or Sarah Franklin and everyone wanted to do on the evangelism side and the marketing side. And so it was an amazing partnership where I feel like the first few years, like, everyone was kind of dialed into what was happening, and all sorts of things were getting created on Trailhead and training resources. I suspect, and even when I was there, it was less and less a part of the conversation. So, advances are made, but probably not as much time spent on, like, okay, great, 2GPs is a thing now, how do you migrate? And so there's probably some things that were missed along the way, even when I was there, to support easier adoption of what was built. So
and I think that's a sentiment that's probably shared widely amongst the community still. Like, often you will see, so true to the core thing when you were at Salesforce. Like, true to the core, a lot of the questions that come at true to the core to Parker and the team are, we've had this thing in the idea exchange for 4, 5, 6 years. Like, it's a good idea. Why haven't you done it? And that, I think that's interesting. Like you say, Salesforce do move on to the next thing and are trying to innovate. And there seems like an absolute goldmine of things that can be worked on to propel the company forward still, but it isn't new and therefore exciting or sexy. I don't know.
I don't know. I think in my time since, I've had different roles and so forth where, I think my perspective is shifted a bit, where now I can look back and think about, like, Salesforce, the Gestalt, like the larger Salesforce, it's got to continue to grow at a pretty massive rate to, keep staying on top of things, right? And so you start thinking about, where does Mark and where does the leadership team at Salesforce need to make their bets in order to keep growing at a rate that everyone expects them to. And it's probably not a surprise that, sadly, the attention and all the investment goes to these new frontiers that have addressable markets that enable that kind of growth. And it may mean that some of the true to the core stuff just, unless there's someone passionate internally, and there are still some PMs in platform, for instance, that are fighting the good fight. Cheryl Feldman, I think, name comes to mind. She joined, I think, shortly after I left, because she was always part of the community, and then I think joined as a PM, I think, after I was gone. But I think she's still fighting the good fight to try to, get stuff done and move forward. And I think there's other PMs doing the same, but it's a little harder to make dramatic change when you're constantly building the next new thing. So
and we see why we're doing it, especially in the age that we are now. This agents and AI is, whether we like it or not, going to be the future. it's here and it's kind of here to stay. It's got
Yeah,
sticky. I mean, I know I don't have a crystal ball. You are now in the AI space yourself, a digital ocean, and I don't have a crystal ball, but it seems like this thing is here to stick around. And
oh
I think
sure.
Salesforce might be early in
I
its
think that.
adoption of agents and
Oh
an
yeah,
agentic future, but
which is a
I
good
think
thing, to be honest. I think like two things that I've noted. So I think Chris Peterson is still doing Apex, or at least doing
yes, I
Apex
believe
and
so.
other stuff. I actually don't know, but at any rate, Chris Peterson was the PM for Apex when I was there, and one of the things that he had wanted to do, and we had talked a lot
Oh, he
about,
went
was
to Heroku actually.
did he go to Heroku with
He went to
Andy?
Heroku. Yeah.
Okay, so someone else is probably responsible for Apex though. But one of the things that we had started was we wanted to effectively create, I don't know, I guess we didn't call it an agent at the time, but basically we wanted to be able to have it create and write Apex code for you. And so, you think about it, like Salesforce is sitting on the largest repository of Apex code in the world. Like imagine fine tuning an LLM on that. So I do believe you keep me honest here, but I feel like I saw something related to like code generation around Apex. And didn't Salesforce deliver that, or am I wrong? Okay,
Not
well
that I've
we'll
seen.
look that up. I thought I saw something, but at any rate, like that was a conversation that we had 2020, and that I think is a really powerful potential application of what it is that they're doing, right? Like an agent built on that a fluent understanding of Apex, but also is very familiar with your particular org, your metadata, your org configuration, your features. I mean, that's super powerful. Imagine an agent that's able to, you can talk to, and it can, you never have to build a flow again in your life. So, which would be a good thing, right? Sorry, I don't want to enter those debates. I always try to stay away from flow versus Apex. But um, my sister, by the way, she still works at Salesforce, and she's actually the TPM for Agentforce. And so I get an opportunity every now and then to hear about what she's doing and keep on top of things. And the potential, I think, for AI agents autonomously doing all sorts of things for us in the future. And I mean, this is the thing Salesforce has always done well. Is think about the App Exchange. Why is it so powerful? It's because it's a trusted app store, and this
Yeah.
emphasis Salesforce puts on trust is so powerful because, you think about like, well, why should I trust installing someone else's metadata in my org? That could be terrible. Well, it's trusted. It was code scanned, reviewed, security reviewed, all those sorts of things. And I think Salesforce brings that same lens and potential to this world of AI agents working autonomously, because end of the day, it's a big trust question, right? Like, what do you actually trust these agents to do? And I think Salesforce, if they do it well, and I'm not here to say whether or not they are, but like they are uniquely positioned, I think, to lean into this aspect of trust that is core to their identity. So I think that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're giving a lot of control and power to the people building them to make sure that they work in the way that they and their business expect them to,
Yeah.
which is the right way in my mind. Wade, as kind of a final question for you, to bring us home. You've spent some time outside of Salesforce now, but as you reflect on your time at Salesforce, what do you think are the one most valuable thing that you learned about your time at Salesforce, and how has that helped you at the companies that you've joined since?
Yeah. I've said this a lot actually. One of the things that I really learned at Salesforce was how important it was for me to build a incredible working relationship with my engineering peers. And so just to step back again, remember Salesforce is a functional environment. Like, so there's basically, for the majority of the time I was there, I was working with someone named Scott Musson, and I have no control over Scott. Scott is responsible for getting things done. He has leadership that doesn't report to my leadership. Again, like, you go all the way to Parker or Benioff until they align. And so the ability to have this alignment and trust built between each other as peers, where there's respect and so forth, was fundamental, and was something. I mean, and it wasn't a given. Like I had to earn it. I had to work hard to build that trust. And I think I definitely took that experience with me, because then I was the CPO at two additional companies, and also had it set up in a functional model where there was either a CTO or a SVP of engineering that I worked with. And so like I got very fortunate where, having learned that experience, I was able to bring it into the next few and really invest the time needed to make that a, highly productive relationship. So I don't know. That's the first thing that came to mind, and one of the probably more useful lessons that I learned there. So
it's served you well.
Yeah, I think so.
Wade, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me and provide this insight to the listeners. It's a really interesting story, and shedding some light on how things happen internally at Salesforce is something that people are always interested in, and why we are the way we are. But there's some lessons that we can take from this and apply that, how we maybe encourage Salesforce to do the right things and keep the encouragement to keep on improving our experience. So I appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll just say, like, I was always a huge fan, I mean, both then and now, of GearSet and all that you've done to support the community as well and build great tools. And I think one of the things that I remember most fondly is, back in the day, it's probably changed now. I think you're a little bit bigger than you were, but you didn't really have a whole lot of marketing, certainly no outbound marketing. And one of the things that you all did was these viral ways of taking all of the errors that you could potentially get when trying to do metadata deployments or like any sort. Basically, you were all great at like finding errors that could occur as a result of something happening in the platform, and writing these great blog posts that ended up having great SEO. It was just like a great front door into GearSet, and prove then to people that the tools you built actually could solve these sort of problems. So there was always that focus on like demonstrated value, which I respect and appreciate. And it was very similar to, kind of the approach that we took, which was like, we really wanted to just deliver value and solve problems. So, it's an honor to be on your podcast. So.
Thank you, Wade. And we're still doing that for the most part. Yes, we've got bigger, but that is the crux of what we do, is solving people's problems and helping them fix it. So I appreciate the kind words, and don't be a stranger.
Well, take care.
Cheers.